Hello, I'm Brian Gill. I'm a voice professor here at NYU. This is my second year actually in the university, and I got here in an interesting way, I guess. I was introduced to music by my father, who's a drummer, and he actually met my mom here at NYU playing at a frat party, and we grew up listening to him play drums, my two brothers and I, who are both musicians as well. And so we all started out on drums. I wasn't very proficient, so I moved on to other things, piano and then bass. And then eventually, once I got up into college, all the way at college, I started majoring as a bass player, double bass and electric bass, and then discovered I had a voice. Strangely enough, it was very late in the game, I thought, but obviously not too late. It was my second year at school, and they were forcing me to be in an ensemble, and I didn't want to get into the university orchestra and saw away because I wasn't used to playing classical bass. I could just play jazz bass, and so I didn't want to make the sound, and so I insisted, give me another ensemble, and they said, we'll give you choir for a semester. And when I did that, I sat next to a voice major who said, dude, you're loud. You should come see my voice teacher. And so I did, and then got a scholarship, and now here I am at NYU. So, performer or teacher, I've actually taught the whole time. When I was a bass player, I learned how to play bass and in a very short period of time. And so at about age 14 or so. And so it was very proficient, luckily. I don't know how it happened, but music's in my family. But by 15, I was very proficient, and I decided to teach. So I started teaching when I was 15 years old at a place called the Guitar Workshop in Charlotte, North Carolina, and then did that until I got into college. Actually, until I went to grad school, so until I was 23. And so I've always done that along with bass, and then it was a natural progression then to start singing, learn how to sing, and then become a teacher of singing at the same time. So I've been teaching voice. I started singing when I was 19, and I started teaching then fairly actively when I was 21. But then very seriously once I got to grad school, so at about 23, and now I'm 35. Classical music was my first, I guess my first teaching experience was with classical music, and then moved on to musical theater, and then moved on into every area: gospel, jazz, R&B, pretty much anything. Anything where the voice is used. I've taught people who are public speakers and have issues with projecting their voice or getting tired when they speak. So yeah, it's moved into everything. And I've gotten more into the science end now. There's a thing called the Vocology Institute out in Denver, Colorado. And I went out there, and I have a certificate in vocology, and it's sort of it's really voice habilitation, rehabilitation. So it's for singers and actors and politicians, anybody, teachers. That's a big market now in voice, is helping teachers maintain their, especially high school and elementary school teachers, helping maintain vocal health while they're speaking over 20, 30 students in a classroom. There is a unifying force in voice that's present in every aspect or every style of singing, like breath flow, things like that. The way a person uses their air and uses their resonators is somewhat similar. And then style comes from the person's own understanding of a style. It's a whole different, I look at it as a whole different ball game. Most of my singers that do multiple styles regularly, professionally, they say, as I have found out myself, they say, I don't really think about it differently technically. It's more of a thought of a stylistic change in my mind that makes it happen, more than me changing the way my voice is produced, which is actually a big argument in the voice field right now. Some people believe that opera is, this sort of swallowed, throaty sound, whereas music theater is very splatty sounding. And I think they're both somewhere in the middle, and they shouldn't be, I guess, made too extreme. Anytime I get a new student in my studio, I listen for a balance in sound. And I listen for, again, whether or not they have airflow, whether or not they've truly tuned into their resonators, meaning it's the mouth and also the nasopharynx, which is up in this region, behind the eyes, behind the nose, and also the pharynx. And it's a specific sound you listen for. It's unique in every voice, so it usually takes a while. I stay away from people who diagnose too quickly and say, that voice is definitely this, because I think it takes several weeks at least, if not months, to truly figure out what a voice should be doing or what their voice type is. And it's very easy once they're on the breath, so to speak, which is using airflow or generating a sound with the flow of air instead of too much pressure, and accessing the resonators the right way. There's certain things that pop up called, the passaggi, or the passages between registers, and where those events occur are very indicative of what a voice is. So it becomes clear. Each time a new student comes in, they each have strengths and weaknesses. And I always tell them my goal is not to change everything they're doing, because the fact is, if you're making a sound, you're doing something right. So I also avoid that tactic of saying it's all wrong. Even if there's some major technical problems, I'll say that we're going to build on their strengths and try and minimize their weaknesses. And so each student is very different, whether it's someone who wants to go into music theater and strengthen their belt, if you will, which is more of a mix of registers more than a yell, or whether it's someone coming from that end who already can belt but doesn't have a very strong head voice. It's going to be a very different approach, I'd say. Bad speech habits infect our singing and oftentimes cause big problems in producing a sound. Sometimes it's just a regional dialect, whether it's too closed an O from Minnesota, and you try and get them to pronounce a vowel that's more neutral, like a standardized English. And you also have to be careful to say that it's not wrong that you pronounce something like that. It's just ineffective when you when you change it to a singing sound. It's inefficient with regard to resonance. So keep your accent in your spoken voice if you want, but then in singing, just realize that it could be ineffective. Although then you get into music like country music, where an accent is actually a benefit. I sang in a country band for a year over in Europe, and I played bass and sang with them. It's the Moody Brothers. They're from North Carolina. And it was hilarious, because the first time I got the job, they said they needed a bass player who sang, and I said, well, I sing opera. That's my main thing. And they said, well, let's give it a try. And they thought it was a funny idea. And I got in there, and the first comment was, you need some more twang in your voice. So I said, all right, great. I'll work on the twang. And I did, and found an easy way to get twang, just without changing what I was doing. I just thought a little bit brighter and thought of my southern accent. And that turned everything around without changing too much what was happening at this level, the vocal fold level. Anytime a student goes to an audition, no matter what it is, I always make sure that I tell them to stay centered and make sure they focus on doing what they know works for them, and not trying to search for what is going to please the people they're auditioning for. I think that's the key to auditioning in general. You find a center point that's easy, that's functional, that's musical, that's beautiful, that's uniquely you, and then you find the place where that fits in. And I think that a lot of us go out in auditions and are so worried about what someone's going to think of us. And we take their words a little too seriously sometimes, and we're willing to sacrifice the basic things that work for us to meet the needs that they have or that they feel we need to be doing. And that's the most damaging thing out there, because no matter what, you're going to have people who love you and you're going to have people who can't stand your voice. It's just the nature of the business. And if you fluctuate so much with somebody saying, oh, I don't like your voice, you need to be doing this, then you're going to sacrifice your voice, and that's not good. So I say stick to what you know works for you and shop it around. Shop it around. Do 100 auditions if you have to, but you'll find a place to fit in. And I think that's the key.
The more the better, huh?
The more the better, yeah. You could do 100 auditions, and if you get 5 gigs for the year, that's great. You're set. You can live off of that. You may be disappointed by the 95 no's, but you have to have a thick skin and just say, forget it. I did what I needed to do, and I found my place. Instead of, they said I was awful, I'm going to change everything now, go back to the drawing board. You can't do that. There are too many opinions out there, and I think that, again, it's not about saying that the other opinions aren't valid or not as, but a person seeing a snapshot of you doesn't know you. And their perception of you is a perception of that snapshot. That's it. And so to take anybody's opinion who hasn't worked with you over time is not healthy. I don't think it's very practical. So that's what I say. Avoid. Don't worry about that. My old voice teacher, who was my mentor, Barbara Dosher, out in Colorado, was great at that, making sure people felt confident and they had a place to go back to. Where they could say, so-and-so at the Met said I should be a character tenor instead of, a romantic lead. And then she would just say, they're mistaken. They're mistaken, and perhaps you sang, maybe too nasal or something, or you were off that day. And she would have a reason and kind of get you back centered and feeling good about yourself, and then you go back out and attack again. So I think that's a job of the teacher, is to stay, to be a support for the student. Yeah, at an audition, dress and attitude are everything, unfortunately, because I think some people are very humble at first and perhaps don't want to come across very confident. I'm not sure what it is. The inherent nature in some people is to be less aggressive, and unfortunately in the music business, to be self-assured in that snapshot that they get of you is key. So to be mild-mannered and here I am, even if you have a great talent, gives the initial impression that you're not going to be, I guess, perhaps self-assured enough to do a role that you might be up for. So I think that that's absolutely a key ingredient in a successful audition. Is no matter what, even if you have weaknesses, go in and pretend you don't. Go in and pretend that you are a done deal and ready to go. So it usually comes across strongly in an audition sense. Warming up is really important. It's yeah, absolutely. It's impossible to sing well without a warm-up. And it's the equivalent, I always tell my students, it's the equivalent of going to the gym. If you weren't to warm up before you were singing, you would go to the gym and lift 200 pounds right from the start. And that's not, although singing is not weightlifting, that would hurt. It wouldn't feel too good. So the warm-up is to get the muscles released and ready to go, and ready to be at your beck and call. And until you've done that, you shouldn't be using them. So that's why I say every morning, I used to wait. I used to go in early on in my teaching career, I used to go in and just teach without warming up. And I found that by the end of the day, I could hardly talk, and I found I wasn't using my voice in the right way. And so now, every morning, whatever, 7:30, I'm sorry, neighbors, I just do a nice warm-up. And for the warm-up, there are many things. Number one, first goal would be get the breath flow going. And there are many things you can do. There are things called lip trills, and you make a sound, of course. And then there are things called raspberries, which I actually prefer, which I'm sure everybody's done a raspberry. Stick your tongue out and make that sound, and then add a sound to that. And that makes sure that you're producing a sound with airflow. And that's the key to a healthy voice. Because you can make a sound that's more pressure-driven, that kind of, and that's not healthy. Some people might like it, so you can't really argue aesthetics, but it's not healthy, and I can't argue that. If it's too pressured a sound, it'll injure the voice over time. So airflows first, those little things, and then scales. And I always start from the top down. Always from the top down, because it goes with the natural breath cycle. If you breathe in, you're dealing with pressures. If you breathe in, you have more lung pressure than at the end of the breath cycle. And it, in general, takes more air pressure to produce a higher note than a lower note. So if you start a voice at the bottom, after they've breathed in, before they've sung, obviously you have to be able to do that once you're warmed up. But if you start them there, you sort of set them up to fail. And so I always start always vocalizes, the vocal exercises from the top down, and then you can do everything after that. Like the first 3 exercises are always top-down exercises. Yeah, and then mix it up. I had many vocal heroes growing up. First one, I guess, is probably a lot of people's, is Luciano Pavarotti. And you got to say it like that. It has to be said that way. Or Pavarotti. And he was definitely my vocal hero. I think he's still, to this day, he was and is one of the most consistent singers and exciting singers that's ever lived. So, yeah, I absolutely loved his voice. And then others, Billy Joel. I love Billy Joel, and it's so funny because from what I've heard through the grapevine, that he doesn't consider himself much of a singer, or used to not. And I think he's got one of the most beautiful voices I've ever heard. So yeah, Billy Joel, James Taylor, yeah, and then Luther Vandross was always one of my favorite singers, especially going into college. I just fell in love with his voice and the way he used it, his musicality. Yeah, I'd say those are my top ones. Yeah, I mean, they affected my life a great deal. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that the ease of singing, my ease of singing was helped a lot by Billy Joel and Luther Vandross, because again, their approach to singing is easy. Especially Luther's was so natural and air-driven, and he could move his voice so effortlessly. It was just like he was sighing at you. It's meditative listening to his music. It just is so effortless. And so when I would sing along with him, anytime I would get in the habit of pushing, it just sounded bad. And you knew it was bad, and you could almost hear him saying from his album, "Don't do that. Take it easy, relax." And so I would do that. I would occasionally do that when I found myself getting into a rut. Although I don't feel my voice is geared towards that music, R&B in particular, or even pop, as much as it is for opera. And I think every voice has to find that. You could do a lot of things, and I think there's some voices out there that can do anything and everything at no expense to their voice. And then I think there are some voices, because of the size of the voice, the loudness or the quality of it, that it's geared towards one thing or another. And mine just happens to be better for opera. So, my top favorites, I guess, I listen to jazz a lot. My brother's a jazz guitar player. He's got a band called Green Light that actually played the last 2 years at the New Orleans Jazz Festival. So they're doing pretty well. They're getting started on their own. And so I listened to their CD. Actually, that's in there. That's one that's in there. So in case my brother watches this, he should know I listen to his CD all the time. And then classical music as well. I think the last thing I listened to there was Jussi Björling, which is another one of my favorite tenors. I think he's got a beautiful voice. The emphasis is on exploring what your voice can do, period. And again, finding where your voice comes alive. So I have my students do everything. I mean, again, music theater and opera for sure, at least those two, the classical and music theater realm. And then over and above that, I have students that do some jazz songs here and some pop songs and country songs. And yeah, so I definitely have everybody explore everything, because if you limit yourself, it can be a hindrance. I also find that later on down the road, if you haven't found your niche, that can be a hindrance as well. I do think that you don't have to limit yourself ever, but I do think that certain voices might lend themselves better to a particular area of music. So I think finding that's key, but limiting yourself early is really a bad idea. You never know. I would have never guessed I would have sung in a country band. And that was an incredible time in my life. So, yeah, and I would have absolutely never would have guessed that. So, don't limit. And my old voice teacher in Colorado, we sang everything. I was definitely more towards opera, but I did a lot of music theater and folk music and things like that with her as well. So, opera singers who make pop records, I think that some of them ignore the style. Yeah. I think they're so afraid of changing their technique that they ignore the style, a lot of them. And that's, I think that can be not, I think it's not very soulful then. So I think that you have to think about what you're singing and think about the overall, the stylistic traits that are involved in producing a pop sound. It's not a big difference, again, in technique. It's a mindset. And I find that a lot of times opera singers will, they'll start singing a song and it's very operatic, and you're like, it's just stick with opera. If you're not going to even think about the style, then just stick with your own strength. Anyone who wants to pursue a creative life should take it very seriously. It can't just be a hobby. It has to be a way of life. It has to be, there has to be an intention behind it, an intention of self-expression, an intention of sharing with people, an intention of helping other people out by creating something beautiful to lift them up. And I think that if that is your intention, you can have a career without a doubt. If your intention is to become famous and rich and all those things, or be well known, which is redundant because it's famous, I think that you might have some success, but it won't be complete. Won't be complete. So I'd say that really look at your motivation for doing what you do, and take the time to process the depth of what it takes to become an artist.